I spent 23 years building something I believed in. At Avicuon Therapeutics, I wasn't just a name on the org chart. I was the architecture behind the company's most successful protocols, the lead on regulatory relationships, and the strategist who could navigate clinical trial mazes with her eyes closed. I joined when we were a scrappy startup sharing office space with a dental clinic. I left just after we were listed in Biopharma's top 10 innovators. Or rather, I was made to leave. When I started, there were 6 of us. No HR department, no press team, no PR fluff. Just science, hustle, and a shared coffee pot that broke twice a week. I remember writing our first FDA submission in the break room, running simulations on weekends, and sleeping under my desk during trial week. I was the one who designed the multi-phase trial template we still used, the same one that got our flagship drug fast track. By the time I was in my 40s, I had a title, Director of Clinical Strategy, but what mattered more was the unspoken understanding. If Diane signed off, it was gold. That was before the change in leadership. When Robert, our founder and CEO, announced his retirement, we all knew things would shift. He was from the old school. Stubborn, sharp, respected. He was also one of the few people who truly understood what I did. When he left, the board brought in someone very different. Jake Hanley, 35, polished, full of startup lingo and media charm. He called himself a brand revitalizer. His first move was launching an Instagram for the company. His second was gutting the operations team and merging R&D with marketing. Jake never said anything rude to my face. He was always respectful, always grateful for my legacy. But I saw it in the meetings. He'd nod at my comments, then pivot to Amelia, our social media intern, as if she had something more valuable to add. He'd started calling our data content and asked if I could simplify the science for broader audiences. He once suggested I mentor some of the junior talent, and when I asked which team, he smiled and said, "We'll find someone eager." My name started disappearing from reports I used to sign. I was asked to streamline my presentations, then told they'd be handled by someone else, closer to the current messaging. A strategy I developed for 3 years was rebranded as the Hanley Initiative. And then came the lunch. Jake took me out to what he called an executive reset. The restaurant was loud, modern, and dimly lit. He talked about direction, agility, and fresh dynamics. And then he said it, "We've been reviewing departmental structures, and we think your expertise would be more impactful in a transition role." I stared at him. "You're suggesting I step aside?" He gave me that polished, rehearsed smile. "Not step aside, step forward into a new chapter. We'd love for you to mentor someone who can continue your impact. Amelia. I blinked. She has incredible instincts. She's sharp, digitally fluent, and the team connects with her energy. Amelia, who has a bachelor's in communications and was hired to run our TikTok page. It's a fast learner." I sat there, my water untouched. My resume could wallpaper the room. My systems had cut 2 years off drug timelines, and this man who had been here less than 10 months was asking me to hand it all over to a girl whose main qualification was good vibes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I told him I'd think about it. I stood up, shook his hand, and left the restaurant without looking back. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and pulled up a folder I'd been quietly working on for 6 months. It was labeled Clinvis. 3 days after that lunch, I received the formal notice from HR. It was dressed in all the usual corporate language: transition opportunity, strategic restructuring, mutual benefit. There was a severance package, of course. It was generous on the surface, but insulting when measured against what I had actually built for them. They offered me 6 weeks to train my successor, after which I would officially exit the organization. No mention of my 23 years of service, no acknowledgement of the countless hours, breakthroughs, or crises I'd pulled us through. Just a paragraph in an internal memo and a calendar invite to an exit integration planning session. I declined the meeting. Instead, I arrived at work the next Monday with a neutral expression and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. People stared as I walked past the bullpen, some with sympathy, some with fear, others pretending not to notice. No one said a word. Not the regulatory lead I'd mentored from her internship, not the head of finance who once told me he trusted no one else with budget forecasts. Silence was the new strategy. Align yourself with the new regime or risk becoming the next name on the list. Jake didn't even bother showing up that morning. He sent Amelia instead. She walked in wearing a bright blazer over a t-shirt that said, "Move fast, break things," carrying a pumpkin spice latte and a folder labeled Legacy Knowledge Transfer. She greeted me with a chirpy, "Hi, Diane," as if this was some kind of internship meet and greet. I stood. "We'll use the conference room." She followed, heels clicking like she owned the place, and I couldn't help but think how young she looked. Too young to remember when we had to fax trial updates to Europe, or when we lost a whole quarter's data because someone spilled coffee on a server. I'd spent years earning every ounce of authority I carried, and here she was, appointed like a princess in a fairy tale. Inside the room, she started by pulling out a PowerPoint deck. The title slide said, "Strategic Transition, Phase 1. She began speaking in buzzwords, asking me to outline mission-critical systems and simplify procedural documentation for scalable onboarding. It was clear she didn't understand half of what she was saying. Worse, she didn't care to. She was performing competence, not practicing it. Over the next few weeks, I walked her through the basics, not because I owed her anything, but because I knew what would happen if I didn't. The team would suffer, trials would be delayed, patients would be impacted, and even as I burned inside, I couldn't bring myself to sabotage what I'd helped build. So I gave her the outline, not the engine. I handed over manuals, but not the instinct. I explained timelines, but not the logic behind them. Meanwhile, Amelia grew more confident. She started ending meetings early. She interrupted department heads. She redesigned our submission templates using pastel fonts and stock photos of smiling people in lab coats. She even renamed our Q3 initiative from Protocol Integrity and Risk Management to Trial Flow 2. I smiled through gritted teeth, reminding myself that none of this would last. The structure was too complex. The stakes too high. Her confidence was built on scaffolding she didn't even know existed. Then came the moment that crystallized it all. She was scheduled to lead a live call with one of our European partners, Zurich Bio. It was a critical meeting, the kind that could make or break a submission schedule. I wasn't invited, but she walked into my office 10 minutes before it started, visibly pale. "Diane, do you remember if their QA lead prefers the revised harmonization model or the 2019 legacy one? I can't find the email." I stared at her. "The harmonization model you signed off on last week." She looked confused. "Well, yeah, but I didn't realize there were 2 versions." "There were 5. I had written all of them." I told her, calmly, that I no longer had access to the internal databases and she should consult the team. She blinked a few times, stammered a thank you, and left. The meeting ran 45 minutes over and ended in confusion. Later that day, I overheard someone from legal muttering about compliance ambiguity and protocol gaps. By the 4th week, the cracks were showing. A partner missed a deadline because they'd received conflicting instructions. A grant proposal was rejected for lack of methodological clarity. The director of quality assurance called me, off the record, and asked if I could review a couple documents that Amelia had edited. I told him no. I was no longer authorized to work on anything for Edvicon. He sighed and said, "I figured, but I had to try." HR sent a cheerful email reminding me of my final day celebration. There would be cake. I deleted the message. On my last morning, I packed my office slowly. I didn't take much, just my degrees, a framed photo of the original 6 of us, and a notebook I kept from the early years, full of hand-sketched process maps. Amelia popped in to say goodbye. She asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime. I said maybe. I handed in my badge, walked past the glass walls I helped design, past the lab I'd fought to get funding for, past the conference room where they once toasted me after our first drug approval. And I didn't look back. What they didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that ClinVis wasn't just a folder on my desktop anymore. It was a registered LLC, with a domain, a logo, a pipeline of private clients, and a signed letter of intent from one of the largest oncology research firms on the West Coast. I wasn't walking away from Edvicon, I was walking towards something I built on my own terms. and I had a feeling they'd realize that much sooner than they expected. The silence after I left was louder than anything I'd heard inside Evicon's polished glass walls. There were no calls, no follow-ups, not even a token LinkedIn comment from Jake or the board. I expected as much. Companies like that don't apologize. They forget. They scrub you from press releases and forward your email to someone who doesn't know how to read the history thread. I gave them a week to pretend I hadn't existed, and then I got to work. Clinvis wasn't just a fallback, it was a design I'd been sketching in the shadows for nearly a year. I knew the storm was coming long before the first thunder rolled in. Jake's appointment was a signal, the shift in tone, the new language, the quiet erasure of veterans. I'd seen it all before. I'd advised 2 startups that were swallowed whole after board-led restructurings. The founders had been reduced to LinkedIn ghosts before their shares even vested. I learned from them, I prepared. I had registered Clinvis under a parent entity in Delaware 6 months before my final day. The branding was discreet but polished. The website was live, invitation on, with no names attached. I hired a design agency out of Austin and paid them under an alias through a secondary business card tied to my consulting work. On paper, I was just a strategic advisor. In reality, I was laying track for a train only I knew was coming. I had also begun conversations, quiet, careful, confidential, with several former partners of Evicon, companies who had grown used to my voice on calls, my language in reports, my corrections in red ink on regulatory drafts. One of them, a boutique oncology lab in San Diego, had pulled me aside at a conference and said, "Whatever happens next, we'd follow you." I didn't forget that. Within 2 weeks of leaving Evicon, Clinvis had 3 active contracts. I didn't announce it on social media. I didn't send a launch email. I simply sent private messages to the right people. I'm available for strategic consulting, discretion guaranteed. Let me know if you'd like to discuss pipeline integrity or trial acceleration timelines. I used language that only people in the trenches would understand. No fluff, no pitch decks, just competence directly offered. The first contract came from a mid-sized biotech firm whose COO had once shadowed me for a quarter. She said their data timelines were slipping and they needed Diane-level triage. I didn't flinch at the phrase. I sent back a proposal with a premium rate and a clause stating all intellectual property would remain with Clinvis unless otherwise negotiated. She signed in under 3 hours. The second came from an academic partnership between 2 research hospitals. They were navigating a complex phase 2/OR overlap and couldn't get FDA alignment. I offered to rework their methodology under a non-disclosure agreement. When I returned their protocol with detailed annotations, their lead investigator wrote back, "I have no idea how you weren't running Evicon." The third, ironically, was a group of frustrated Evicon employees. One of them, discreetly using a Proton mail address, reached out and said, "Amelia is drowning. Everything's behind. The submission package got rejected last week for inconsistencies. Can you help? Off the record." I didn't answer immediately. I poured coffee, sat on my balcony, watched the birds scramble for space on the power lines. Then I replied with 2 lines. "I'm unavailable for anything involving Evicon at this time. Best of luck moving forward." I didn't owe them rescue. Meanwhile, Jake and Amelia were learning the hard way what I had always known: you can't outsource experience. You can't fake intuition. You can't replace 23 years of failures, corrections, and recalibrations with Canva templates and enthusiasm. Clients were growing cold, partnerships delayed, rumors spread through the industry like wildfire. Evicon's internal processes were a mess. The leadership change had backfired, and no one was sure who was actually running regulatory strategy. Through quiet channels, I learned that one of their trial arms had been flagged for redundancy and a European partner had formally requested to renegotiate their terms. I also heard that Amelia had missed an essential audit checkpoint because she wasn't aware that those protocols had to be submitted in hard copy as well as digital. Apparently, she assumed everything could be uploaded to a cloud drive. Clinvis, by contrast, was lean, sharp, and built around the kind of brutal competence that can only be honed in high-stakes rooms. I didn't have a social media team or a marketing director. I had trust, I had precision, I had clients who paid my full rate without haggling because they knew I delivered. I turned down 2 potential contracts in the 3rd month, not because I didn't need the money, but because I refused to scale too quickly. My systems had to be perfect. I wouldn't replicate the chaos I'd left behind. One night, well past midnight, I got a message from a former junior analyst at Evicon. She'd been one of the few who looked me in the eye when I left. Her email read, "I don't know how to say this, but I've been following what you're doing. I'd like to work with you. I want to learn for real, not just how to present data, but how to think about it the way you do." I hired her the next day. And just like that, ClinVis took its first step from consultancy to movement. I wasn't just offering expertise, I was offering a different way to build, without arrogance, without noise, without the hollow posturing that had infected the company I once gave everything to. Evicon had made their choice. I was now building something they couldn't control, predict, or compete with, and I hadn't even gone public yet. It started with a voicemail. "Hi Diane, this is Carla from Regulatory at Evicon. I was wondering if you might have a moment to connect. There's a small issue with one of the old protocol chains. Amelia said you might still have some of the original mapping logic. We're having trouble aligning a couple of endpoint verifications and, well, if you could spare a minute, that would be really appreciated." I listened to it twice, then deleted it. 2 days later, an email came in, this time from Jake's assistant. "Mr. Hanley would like to discuss a potential short-term consulting opportunity regarding legacy documentation and process continuity. Please let us know your availability." I didn't reply, but I did forward the message to my attorney who helped draft a polished response. "Ms. Whitmore is currently unavailable for pro bono consultation. Should you wish to discuss a formal consulting agreement, please submit a written proposal outlining scope, time frame, and compensation. Her current rate is $675.00/hour, with a 6-hour daily minimum." I didn't think they'd take it. They did. 3 days later, I was sent a formal agreement. I raised the daily minimum to 8 hours, included a clause that I would communicate only through written channels, and added a term that I could disengage at any time without notice. They signed within 24 hours. Desperation does that to people. The first task was as simple as it was telling, reverse engineering a protocol flowchart that Amelia had attempted to update. The original file was missing. The archive contained mislabeled versions. What they had submitted to the European board had inconsistencies so glaring I couldn't understand how they hadn't caught them sooner. The chart was supposed to match a submission packet I'd authored 18 months prior. Instead, half of it looked like it had been drawn by someone who had skimmed a glossary 5 minutes before opening PowerPoint. I restructured the document, annotated the timeline, and returned it with a note. "Do not alter formatting. This version is audit compliant. Confirm receipt within 24 hours. They confirmed receipt in 12. From that moment on, the requests poured in. First quietly, then with growing urgency. Timeline audits, risk model corrections, endpoint alignment matrices. Amelia didn't reach out directly, though I knew she wanted to, but I could tell which edits were hers by the formatting alone. She loved purple bullet points and rounded text boxes. She also had a habit of highlighting key terms that weren't actually key. She once flagged the word intervention in a table labeled intervention matrix. I nearly laughed. And yet, I didn't hate her. That surprised me. She was thrown into something she never should have been part of. The fault wasn't hers, not really. It was Jake's. He wanted someone pliable, someone young and wide-eyed and full of phrases like optimization pipeline and digital forward. He thought appearances could replace depth, but depth is what holds the structure together. Within 6 weeks, I had rewritten over a dozen core documents. I tracked each hour, sent weekly invoices. They paid on time. They had no choice. Their regulatory calendar was collapsing, and I was the only person who could rebuild it from memory. Meanwhile, ClinVis was accelerating. I hired a second analyst, then a third. My reputation, still unofficial, still quietly guarded, was spreading through the industry. People weren't posting it online. They were calling each other. They were whispering in meeting rooms and texting former colleagues. "Have you heard what Diane's doing? She's still in the game." and better than ever. I began getting requests I had to turn down, not because I didn't want them, but because I was careful. I wasn't building a second Evicon, I was building something tighter, smarter, faster. We didn't take every client. We didn't chase funding. We delivered, quietly and exactly. One afternoon, I received a document from Evicon labeled Trial Flow Recalibration Framework. I opened it, expecting more nonsense. Instead, I found a copy of a methodology I'd authored 3 years prior, with only the title changed. There were no acknowledgments, no references, no citation of my name. It was my language, my structure, my calculations, wrapped in someone else's branding. I sent a cease and desist notice through my lawyer that same evening. It wasn't about money, it was about credit. You can fire me, erase me, replace me, but you do not steal my work and pretend it was yours. That's not reinvention, that's theft. The next morning, I received a call from someone unexpected, one of the board members. Her voice was calm but strained. Diane, I just wanted to say, we had no idea things had become this chaotic. We were led to believe the transition was under control. Your work, your legacy is still deeply respected here. I let her speak, then said, my work isn't your legacy anymore. It's Clinvis now. There was a pause. Then she said, I understand. Later that week, one of my private clients forwarded me a slide deck they'd received from Jake's team. It contained proposed partnerships for long-term R&D optimization. My name wasn't mentioned, but the framework clearly mirrored the structure I'd developed for that same client 6 weeks earlier, word for word in some parts. I didn't say a thing I didn't need to. That client canceled their pending agreement with Evicon and signed an exclusive contract with Clinvis, a 3-year deal, 7 figures. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I sat at my desk, opened a fresh notebook, and began sketching the next layer of Clinis. Not just consulting, infrastructure, licensing, strategic IP development. My old company wanted to survive the quarter. I was planning for the decade. Evicon was beginning to feel the pressure, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone on the inside cracked. The cracks had already started forming, and I had only just begun. By the time I signed the exclusive contract with Generis Biosolutions, I knew Evicon would never recover its footing. Clinvis had officially entered a new phase, no longer a whisper in industry circles, but a known force with leverage. I wasn't just reclaiming what they had stripped from me, I was designing a new center of gravity, and the industry, slowly but surely, began shifting toward it. Generis was a turning point. They weren't just a client, they were an anchor. The 3-year deal involved full-cycle consulting on 3 parallel drug programs, including early-phase strategy, audit preparation, and regulatory navigation across both US and EU frameworks. It was the kind of contract that usually went to legacy firms with bloated teams and even more bloated budgets, but I'd proven to them in less than 2 months of preliminary advising that my team of 5 could do what their previous vendors couldn't in half a year. No fluff, no recycled frameworks, just sharp, customized execution every single time. When the deal closed, I didn't announce it. I didn't even update my LinkedIn profile. But Evicon found out. Their business development director tried to schedule a catch-up call with Generis' COO the following week and received a polite but direct decline. A week after that, one of their internal strategy memos, someone leaked it anonymously, described Clinvis as a rising competitor with former institutional knowledge and highly agile implementation structures. That was the sanitized version. The informal feedback I heard through a mutual contact was less graceful. They're panicking. They thought she was just consulting. They didn't realize she'd start building a brain trust. Internally, Evicon was cracking. 2 department leads had resigned within the same quarter. One of them, a compliance officer, emailed me from a personal account to thank me for raising the bar. He didn't say more, but he attached a list of inconsistencies in Evicon's current documentation stack. 8 pages long. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They were disintegrating, and I wasn't lifting a finger. Amelia, to her credit, was still showing up. Her name kept appearing in revision chains and summary emails, but her inputs were clearly being filtered. Most of what came my way during the tail end of my consulting contract with Evicon was routed through the new director of regulatory risk, an external hire brought in to stabilize the division. He had experience. He also had exhaustion in his voice every time he wrote, like someone trying to repair a ship that had been sabotaged from within. At one point, he sent me an early draft of a submission they were preparing for the mid-phase protocol update. I recognized several formatting errors immediately, along with a critical misinterpretation of a dose escalation matrix I had designed back when I was still full-time. I flagged the issues in track changes, annotated the logic, and returned the document without any commentary. He responded with, "God bless you," in the email header. That was the last file I ever worked on for them. The contract expired 2 weeks later, and I let it lapse without renewal. The next move was mine. I decided to make it quietly and surgically. The same week my last invoice to Eviquan cleared, I onboarded a new client, Arcline Therapeutics, small, well-funded, and ready to launch 2 orphan drug trials. I sent them a white-labeled version of the same methodological toolkit Eviquan had once tried to rebrand as Trial Flow Recalibration. This time my name was printed on the cover, beneath the ClinViz logo. No one else's, no more erasures, no more stolen credit. It didn't take long for someone at Eviquan to notice. I received a brief, fumbling message from Jake himself. "Hi Diane, hope you're well. Just wanted to say I've been following your work, very impressive. Would be great to connect sometime, maybe see if there's space for collaboration down the line. Let me know." I stared at the message for 5 minutes before closing the tab. Then I opened a private browser window and checked Eviquan's latest filings. A noticeable drop in projected earnings. A delay in one of their trial extensions. Their upcoming FDA meeting had been postponed. No reason listed. And then something unexpected happened. Amelia called me. Not emailed, not messaged, called, direct to my number. I hesitated but answered. Her voice was thin, too rehearsed to be confident, too forced to be casual. "Hi Diane, I know this is probably weird, but I just wanted to reach out personally." I said nothing. I know things didn't go the way they should have. And I also know I wasn't ready. I thought I could learn it fast, pick it up as I went, but it's more than just reading documents. It's judgment. And I don't have it yet. Still, I said nothing. I guess I'm calling because Jake is leaving, stepping down, and there's talk about rebuilding things, doing it right this time. And I don't know if you ever wanted to come back or even just... I cut her off, calmly. "Amelia, I appreciate the call, but I've moved on, and honestly, you should too." There was silence. Then she said, "I thought you'd say that." I almost told her I didn't blame her, but I didn't. That would be a kindness she hadn't earned. I hung up, placed my phone face down, and went back to reviewing a new proposal from a European partner interested in licensing ClinViz methodology. They'd cited 3 separate documents I'd authored, 2 of which had been the cornerstone of my old department's success. And now, those same documents were under my full control. This wasn't revenge, this was structure, strategy, legacy. They had replaced me with someone who could speak in front of cameras and pitch buzzwords to boardrooms. I'd responded by building something they couldn't understand, let alone replicate. And I was just getting started. 2 months after Jake stepped down, a press release hit the industry wires. Eviquan Therapeutics announces strategic restructuring and operational realignment. The language was hollow and desperate, filled with phrases like renewed focus, internal recalibration, and legacy integration. No mention of the hemorrhaging partnerships. No acknowledgement of the growing exodus of their senior staff. No public word about the lawsuits quietly emerging from vendors who were promised deliverables that never materialized. But inside the industry, people knew. Whispers traveled faster than announcements. Everyone was talking, and the message was clear. Eviquan had fallen apart. What hadn't made the press was far more telling. At least 4 major accounts had transitioned to new vendors in under 60 days. A 5th, Altera Biosciences, terminated their 3-year contract early, citing misalignment of strategy and deliverables. I had advised Altera just months before. Their CEO, a blunt and pragmatic woman named Grace Lynn, sent me a private message. "You were right, they had no plan. We're not taking chances anymore. Expect something from us soon." Within the week, I received a draft proposal for a 12-month engagement with ClinViz. Their opening line in the scope of work: "This project depends on execution, not optimism." At ClinViz, we were scaling with precision, not fast, not loud, deliberately. I brought on a compliance officer, someone I'd worked with in the early days of Avicon who had left after Jake's arrival. I hired a clinical documentation lead from a rival firm, someone whose discipline and clarity reminded me of the way things used to run before vanity crept into the hierarchy. We didn't use titles, no chiefs, no vice presidents. We had roles, responsibilities, and delivery dates. That was it. We didn't operate from prestige. We operated from pressure-tested systems. Our contracts were clear, our timelines aggressive, and our margin for error non-existent. That was our reputation now, and it was working. Meanwhile, Avicon sent another inquiry, this time through legal channels. They wanted to discuss licensing options for the methodologies I had authored before my exit, specifically the risk matrix design and dose-response escalation model I had reworked into a proprietary system under ClinViz. The irony was almost poetic. What they once dismissed as old, expensive, and replaceable had become something they now needed to buy back. I forwarded the request to my legal team, who replied with a concise counter: licensing rights available at $2,200,000, 0 cents, with a 3-year cap, exclusive use, limitations, and full attribution requirements. There was no response for several days. Then came a new message, this time from an external representative acting as an intermediary. She asked if there was room to renegotiate the scope of the licensing terms in light of the historical relationship. I responded with a single sentence: the rate reflects the cost of undervaluing vision. By this point, people who had once treated me like a background fixture were now treating me like a market threat. At a biotech roundtable in New York, I overheard 2 senior partners from rival firms discussing the Whitmore effect, their term for the way clients were starting to shift their trust toward individual expertise over institutional size. That wasn't my intention, but I wasn't correcting them either. The truth was, my work had never been about personal ego. I never cared about being a figurehead. I cared about doing things right. The system failed when Avicon prioritized youth over judgment, flash over foundation. I just built the counterexample. Then came the moment I didn't expect. I received a hand-delivered letter from Avicon's board. A real letter, heavy envelope, gold seal. Inside was a formal invitation to rejoin the company, this time as executive advisor to the new interim CEO and chair of the R&D redevelopment committee. The compensation package was significant. The terms were flexible. The wording was deferential, full of phrases like restore integrity, rebuild trust, honor the legacy of foundational leadership. I read it twice, then closed the folder and slid it across my desk. The next morning, I asked my assistant to schedule a meeting with my team. We sat around a simple table in the ClinViz office. No glass walls, no catered snacks, no executive perks. Just 5 of us, reviewing project loads, client expansion, and next phase hiring. I told them about the letter. They listened, said nothing for a long moment. Then the analyst, who had once been my intern at Avicon, looked at me and said, "If you go back, they'll own the story. If you stay here, you write the next chapter." That afternoon, I drafted a response and declined the offer. I didn't need a title to have influence. I had influence because I had impact. A week later, Avicon issued another press release. This one tried to reframe the chaos as a growth realignment. They appointed a new CEO from outside the industry, a consultant with 0 experience in pharmaceuticals but a long resume in corporate transformation. Investors were unimpressed. 2 of their largest shareholders reduced their positions. Stock dipped another 12%. The final blow came not from me, but from the clients themselves. One by one, the companies that had once leaned on Avicon began aligning themselves with ClinViz, not just for consulting, but for end-to-end solution design. We weren't just fixing gaps. We were building new systems from scratch, faster, smarter, with the kind of quiet, relentless discipline that institutions forget once they grow too comfortable. I never made a speech. never posted a victory lap, but the silence from Evicon told me everything. They no longer viewed me as a liability. They now understood that I had always been the foundation. And once they kicked me out, I simply took the blueprint with me. 1 year after I walked out of Evicon for the last time, I found myself standing in front of a packed auditorium at the Global Clinical Strategy Summit in Boston. I hadn't planned on speaking. In fact, I'd turned down the keynote invitation 3 times before finally agreeing under one condition: no introductions, no fanfare, and no mention of my former employer. I wasn't interested in being remembered for where I had been pushed out. I was there to speak about what I had built. The room was filled with decision makers, researchers, startup founders, and regulatory consultants, many of whom had followed the quiet arc of Clinvis over the past 12 months. Some had worked with us directly, others had lost clients to us. Everyone in that room had heard enough rumors to know the broad outline, but no one, until that day, had heard me speak publicly since my departure. I didn't talk about Evicons, I didn't mention names. Instead, I talked about systems, how trust is not built through hierarchy, but through clarity, how legacy isn't protected through titles, but through execution. I showed case studies, anonymized but unmistakable to those who knew. I demonstrated how Clinvis had cut submission times by 28%, reduced audit revisions to near zero, and maintained full compliance across 5 regulatory zones simultaneously. I could see heads nodding, I could feel the shift. After the talk, a young woman approached me. She looked barely 30, sharp-eyed, with a badge that read Regulatory Associate, Synex Labs. She waited until the crowd thinned, then asked if she could ask something off the record. I nodded. "Did you really build all of Clinvis after they let you go?" Or smiled. "They didn't let me go, they just gave me the space to start." And later that evening, back in my hotel suite, I reviewed a proposal from a major European agency looking to license our entire documentation framework as the default model for their cross-border trial consortium. It was the kind of offer that would have taken years of pitching, networking, and internal politics to even get noticed in my old life. At Clinvis, they came to us, not because we were loud, but because we were reliable, effective, proven. That night, I poured a glass of wine and opened the original Clinvis notebook, the same one I had started the evening Jake suggested I train his niece. The pages were full, every margin scribbled, every outline annotated. There wasn't a single word about revenge inside, only structure, vision, direction. It had never been about getting back at them. It was about getting free. Somewhere, I knew Evicon was still struggling. Amelia's LinkedIn had gone quiet. Jake had moved into branding consultancy, his profile now full of phrases like growth advisor and founder whisperer. Their board had appointed a 3rd CEO in less than a year, and the clients they'd once taken for granted now sent their contracts to us. I didn't need their apology. I'd had their market. The next morning, one of our new hires asked me during onboarding, "So what's your official title here?" I paused, then said, "I don't have one, just call me Diane." She laughed. Seriously. Titles are for people who need to be reminded of their value." She nodded. I could tell she understood. And just like that, I realized I hadn't just outlasted the system that tried to erase me, I'd replaced it. Quietly, entirely, on my own terms,